Hi guys, Dr. Goldberg here. I want to spend a little bit of time going over the slides on chapter 2. I'm going to do this for some of the chapters, not all of the chapters. I didn't want to do it on the first chapter because I'd already hit you up with two videos for that, so I didn't want to do a third one. I'm limited to 15 minutes on these, so I'm going to touch on some points, but not all. Don't assume that if I don't cover it, it's not important, because it's all important, but I have more to say about some things than others. So. I'm going to leave it to you to go through the learning objectives. So we're going to be talking about sort of the historical roots of management, and you can see this page sort of outlines some key features over the course of history, and sort of brings us up to the Industrial Revolution, because in the Industrial Revolution, that's really when we saw a whole lot of research being done. From that point on, research being done on management in general. The Industrial Revolution was important because it transformed the way we do work. Having electricity obviously made a big difference in how we were able to produce things, because we were largely a manufacturing economy. And it also meant that work could be done in factories. So everybody was congregating into a single factory, whereas prior to that, people worked in small shops, their homes, out in the field if they did agriculture, etc. So those are two major changes. One of the first movements, if you will, in the history of management is what's called the scientific management movement. And that's generally attributed to Frederick Taylor. And basically the idea behind scientific management is that you need to sort of think through exactly how people do their work in order to get an idea of how they can do it more efficiently. He also, whoops, sorry, went in the wrong direction. He also talks about the idea that there needs to be some division of responsibility in between what the manager does and what the employee does, so that the employee can be put in the position that they're best suited to do. And that holds true all the way to today, where we use job descriptions as a means of determining who's going to be the best candidate in terms of his or her ability to perform particular job functions. Gilbreth, in addition, the Gilbreths, in addition to Taylor, sort of promoted this idea that if you study the actual physical motions that people perform when they're doing work, you can get an idea of how things can be done more effectively. So they physically noted what movements people did with their hands, with their legs, etc., as they were on assembly lines, so that they could determine the most efficient way for people to do it. While this was very practical and did in fact lead to increased efficiency, the downside of it is it really made for very boring work. If you can imagine having somebody analyze you doing your schoolwork, if they broke it down to turns the page, types at his or her keyboard, so on and so forth, it makes your job as a student sound very different from what actually is going on in terms of the learning, the integrating information, etc. So it is very limited to very physical jobs, ones that are easily observable. Gantt was actually a protege of Frederick Taylor, so he sort of furthered Frederick Taylor's work on scientific management, and his big contribution is what's called a Gantt chart. And a Gantt chart, which is shown on the next page, actually sort of looks at a project over time and breaks it into subtasks. And that's generally a good idea for anything you do. So for example, if you're working on your wiki, for example, for this class, you want to sort of look at when the final deadline is and then say, okay, so we're going to have to come up with a draft by date X, and in order to come up with this draft, we need to do research by some other date, so on and so forth, and work backwards and come up with a project schedule for accomplishing work. And people still use these in the real world today. Moving on to bureaucracy, bureaucratic management, Max Weber, he's German, so it's Weber, not Weber. When we hear the word bureaucracy, we think red tape. So it generally carries a lot of negative connotations, and certainly those connotations are not incorrect, but there actually is a lot of value to bureaucracies as well. If you can imagine, in some organizations, if you can imagine, for example, the military, it's a very bureaucratic a very bureaucratic organizational structure. So you have a general conveying information down to the next in line, so on and so forth. And if you think about how information is communicated, it goes through multiple levels before it actually reaches the men and women serving on the front lines. And that's good because I really, as a citizen, don't want some 19-year-old with an AK-47 in his hand making executive decisions that are really better reserved for a general. So bureaucracies certainly have their place in certain types of organizations, but generally when we think of bureaucracies, we think of them when they're in organizations where they don't necessarily belong. We think of Department of Motor Vehicles, where to get a question answered, somebody has to ask their supervisor, who asks their supervisor, who asks their supervisor. So those are the downsides of bureaucracy. And if you look at the next slide, I'm not going to go in, I'm sort of running short on time, but it talks about some of the elements of bureaucracies and, you know, how a lot of them really aren't necessarily negative in nature. So having managers supervise, recording things in writing, that's always a good idea because if you make a decision, you want to know in the future how we made that decision so we can make a decision similarly for the next case that arises. Administrative management has to do really with the focus on leadership. That's really when we started thinking about the importance of leadership and the characteristics that good leaders have. And it was originated by Henri Fayol, a Frenchman. And really his focus was on, well, you know, as a manager, I may be telling my employees that I want them to do X, but whether or not they do X depends a lot on my skills as a leader. It's not necessarily the fault of the employee or their lack of skill if the employee is not carrying out the tasks or the commands, if you will, that I'm issuing. It's partly a function of partly a result of my failings as a leader. So it has to do with the leader's ability to divide work into different functional areas so that everybody knows what his or her job is. He's got 14 principles, and some of these I'm going to focus on here: unity of command, unity of direction. As you get into the next page, it notes that these are no longer applicable in modern organizations, and that's because it's not uncommon these days. For example, if you work in a consulting firm, you don't have a unity of command because you typically report to two supervisors. You may have a project supervisor for the particular project you're working on, but you'll also have your regular manager, your functional area manager. If you're in marketing, you're still going to report to your marketing manager in addition to reporting to your project manager. So today's organizations don't really comply with all 14 principles, but likewise, we don't really have stability of tenure of personnel because people come and go in organizations at a much more rapid pace than they did several decades ago. Mary Parker Follett really focused on the constructive nature of conflict. So conflict is here to stay. You'll have conflicts in work, you'll have conflicts in your family, you'll have conflicts in your romantic relationships, etc. And she really focused on drawing out the positives of conflict because we think of the word conflict, again, it carries a very negative connotation. Her focus was on the benefits of conflict, reaching an integrative resolution to conflict. So we tend to think of conflict as a fixed sum game, or excuse me, a zero sum game. That is, if I win, you lose, and so we're vying for the same pieces of a fixed pie. But she was focused on integrative conflict resolution, whereby both parties can actually get at least part of what they want instead of one party winning at the other party's loss. And the next slide goes over some of her views on both on conflict as well as on power, giving orders, and authority. And the basic gist is um, just because, sort of similar to Fayol, just because you're a leader and you tell your subordinates they should do something doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to do it. Part of it lies on you as a manager or a leader. Okay, that brings us to Elton Mayo, who conducted what are now very famous the Hawthorne studies, which I always have trouble saying. The Hawthorne plant was a manufacturing plant, and the interesting thing about these studies is what he found, although it's cited today, decades later, nearly 100 years later, as being seminal in the history of management, was discovered quite by accident. Um, Part of his discoveries had to do with just the enormous impact that simply paying attention to employees had. So they were doing some experiments in the plant, and while the experiments were going on, they changed the lighting. Not part of the experiment. This was just an incidental thing. They changed the lighting, and then what they found was just changing the lighting made productivity soar. And so they concluded that it's not the lighting so much per se, but that the employees felt, wow, somebody cares about me enough to make the lighting better in my workplace. And that in and of itself was enough to improve their productivity. The other major contribution of the Hawthorne studies is that it really put a focus on understanding that people on a production line, because realize these are all assembly line studies, it's very isolating work, and by focusing too much on the time and motion stuff that I talked about before with Frederick Taylor, as well as the Galbraiths, there's too much focus on the task and not any focus on the interaction, the human interaction. And most of us, when we're in the workplace, expect to have some human interaction, and that's an important part. And we tend to, in fact, perform more productively when we have more interaction with our coworkers. Not too much, because obviously you don't want to just shoot the breeze all day, but having some interaction with coworkers enables employees to be more satisfied and consequently improve their performance. Chester Barnard, sort of again going back to the notion of what some of this falls on managers. It's not all about employees not obeying orders. It's about what authority figures, managers and leaders, do to generate cooperation and acceptance of authority. So a lot of it has to do with how they perceive the authority member. Sometimes we have managers in the real world that aren't necessarily the most competent people. You might say to yourself, they just got this job because they're the son of the owner or something like that, or the daughter of the owner. And sometimes that's the case, and you might say, but they really don't have any brains or competence in the area. So that's going to affect the extent to which people will cooperate with the organization. He also focused on this notion of a zone of indifference, and that is people will generally agree to management directions, that is, not question them or not try and work against them, if they understand what the directives of the organization are, if they understand what, if they understand what the leader has to say about it, if what the leader says is consistent with the goals of the organization, if it's compatible with the employee's own personal interests, and if the employee has the ability to actually carry it out. I have about 30 seconds left, so I'm going to skip on to systems management. Focus of systems management is on the interrelationship between inputs and outputs. So how the organization, the systems within the organization interact amongst themselves, as well as with the broader external society. So with 15 seconds left, I'm going to end it here. Have a great week. I'll talk to you next week or next time. Take care. Bye.